I don't say things twice. That's something my grandmother always told me. Say it once, mean it, and let people decide what to do with it. I was 26 years old when I finally understood what she meant. Standing in the middle of a parking lot in the rain, holding a cardboard box with everything I owned in it, I made myself a promise. I would never beg anyone to love me again. I have not broken that promise. My name is Sloane. I'm 38 now. I own a consulting firm in Portland with 11 employees, a mortgage on a house I chose entirely for myself, and a dog named Biscuit who sleeps on the good couch, and I don't care. My life is quiet, and mine, and I built every single piece of it with my own hands. 18 months ago, my former in-laws showed up at my front door. They wanted something. They always wanted something. I met my ex-husband Connor when I was 22. He was funny and charming and came from the kind of family that owns a lake house and refers to it simply as the lake. His mother Judith wore linen in October and had opinions about cheese. His father Richard coached youth hockey for 30 years and spoke in the kind of confident, slow voice that makes people assume he's wise even when he isn't saying anything particularly useful. They were intimidating in the way only upper-middle-class families can be. Not through cruelty exactly, but through the quiet accumulation of standards you didn't know existed until you failed to meet them. I grew up in Boise. My mom was a home health aide. My dad drove long haul until his back gave out. Then he drove shorter haul. We were not poor exactly. We just didn't have a lake. When Connor brought me home for the first time, Judith shook my hand at the door. Not a hug, a handshake. She smiled the whole time, but her eyes were doing something else entirely. I noticed. I filed it away and told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. We got married when I was 24. Small ceremony. Connor's family was gracious about it in the way that means they were not gracious at all. His aunt told me at the reception during the toast that Connor had been expected to marry someone from back home. She said it like a compliment and then looked at me like I was a stain. I laughed. I did the thing where you assume people don't mean what they obviously mean. I was good at that then. The first 2 years were mostly fine. Connor and I had an apartment in Seattle. I was working in accounts receivable at a mid-sized logistics company. Not glamorous, but I was good at it, and I knew it, and I was taking night classes in financial analysis because I had a plan. I always had a plan. It's the thing about me that Connor found attractive at first and then, later, found threatening. His family started coming up more often around year 3. His parents had a standing invitation to stay with us whenever they were in Seattle, which turned out to be every 6 to 8 weeks. Judith would arrive and immediately begin reorganizing things. Not obviously. She'd just move the dish towels, or suggest that the rug in the entryway was a tripping hazard, or mention, lightly, that the neighborhood we'd chosen was fine, but that there was a new development in Bellevue that was supposed to be very nice. I used to clean for 2 days before they came, scrubbed things that weren't dirty, made my home into a showroom because I was 25 and terrified of being found wanting. Connor never told them to stop. When I asked him about it, carefully, always carefully, he said I was too sensitive. He said his mom was just trying to help. He said, once, with genuine puzzlement on his face, "Why does it bother you so much? She likes you." That was the moment I realized he genuinely did not see it, or he saw it and had decided, long before I came along, that pretending not to was easier. Things shifted after his grandmother died. Grandma June, Connor's maternal grandmother, passed away when we'd been married about 4 years. She was 91, lived a full life, went peacefully. But she left behind a trust, a significant one. The terms of the trust were specific. Assets would be distributed to Judith's branch of the family only after all outstanding family debts were cleared, and only to married heirs in good standing. I only learned about that trust much later. What I knew at the time was that after the funeral, Judith's behavior toward me changed. She became warmer, more attentive. Suddenly she had opinions about how Connor and I should be saving money, about real estate, about having children sooner rather than later. She asked me once, over brunch, whether I'd thought about a timeline. I was holding a mimosa. I put it down very slowly. A timeline for what? I said. For starting a family, she said. You're not getting any younger, sweetheart. I was 28. Connor laughed like she'd said something charming. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood there for 3 minutes looking at my own face in the mirror, very calmly deciding how much longer I was going to do this. The answer turned out to be 2 more years. 30 months to be exact, because I am thorough even in the ways I stay too long. What ended it wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no single explosion. It was more like I woke up one Tuesday morning and did the math on my own life and realized I had been slowly handing myself over in pieces. My preferences, my weekends, my voice in rooms, and I had almost nothing left that was purely mine. Connor was a good man in the way that means he never meant to hurt me and also never bothered to stop it. I filed for divorce at 30. We had no children. The settlement was clean and fair because I made it that way. I took my half of our joint savings, $42,000, and I moved to Portland because I had no particular history there, and I needed to be somewhere I'd chosen just for myself. Judith cried at the news. Richard shook his head slowly, like I'd made a disappointing business decision. Connor called me once, 2 weeks later, to ask if I was sure. I told him I was sure. I was very, very sure. Building something from nothing is not inspirational while it's happening. People want to hear that part now. The grit, the grind, the 5 a.m. alarm and the cold showers and the journaling. But honest to God, the first 8 months in Portland were just lonely and kind of ugly. I had a studio apartment that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's dog. I was working remotely for a small consulting firm, billing 40 hours a week. Spending my evenings rebuilding a business plan I'd been sketching on napkins for 3 years. I knew numbers. That was the thing I knew. I knew how companies hid losses and where the gaps were, and how to read a financial statement the way a doctor reads a face. Not just what it says, but what it's trying not to say. I've been doing this work for other people's companies for years. I knew it was time to do it for myself. I started my firm, Callaway Financial Consulting, at 31. I called it that because it's my mother's maiden name and she worked harder than anyone I've ever known and never once got her name on anything. I wanted it on something. The first year I had 3 clients and made barely enough to cover rent. I ate a lot of rice and beans without any irony about it. I drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard that I'd named Gerald. Gerald and I loved about 40,000 miles that first year driving to client meetings I sometimes wasn't fully sure I was ready for. I was always ready. That was the thing. I just didn't know it yet. By 33, I had 7 clients. By 35, I had brought on my first 2 employees, both women who were better at certain things than I was, which is exactly what I was looking for. The firm was small, but we were profitable and our retention rate was almost perfect, which in consulting is everything because the work speaks before you do. I bought my house at 36. 3 bedrooms, old craftsman, a backyard big enough for a garden I was unrealistically optimistic about. I stood in the empty living room on the first day I owned it and said out loud to no one, I did this. Biscuit showed up at the shelter about 3 months later and he looked at me through the kennel bars with the most exhausted expression I've ever seen on a dog, and I completely understood him and we have been inseparable ever since. My life was not perfect. I had hard weeks and slow months and moments of doubt that came at 2 a.m. and felt very large. But it was mine. Every piece of it, mine. And then, on a Saturday afternoon in April, my doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen when it rang. Biscuit lifted his head from the couch, which is how I know something is actually at the door versus a neighbor walking past. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole. Judith. Richard. They were both dressed like they'd come from somewhere nice. Judith had on a cream-colored blazer. Richard was in a button-down. They looked older than I remembered. It had been almost 8 years since I'd seen either of them in person. They also looked, even through a fisheye peephole lens, slightly nervous. I stood there for a moment. I want to be honest about this. I was not particularly afraid. I was not particularly angry either. I was something closer to curious. The way you're curious when an old injury starts aching again for no obvious reason. Not painful exactly, just strange. A reminder that something happened here once. I opened the door. Sloane, Judith said. She was smiling, but it was the careful kind of smile. The kind that's been practiced. We hope this isn't a bad time. I looked at her, then back at her. How did you get my address? I said. Richard cleared his throat. Connor mentioned Connor doesn't have my address, I said. Silence. We may have found it through some other means, Judith said carefully. I absorbed that for a second. I noted it. I let it sit right where it was. What do you want? I said. Judith's careful smile shifted slightly. She was recalibrating. I could see it. Can we come in? We'd love to catch up. It's been so long and we've thought about you often, Sloane. Sloane, truly. What do you want? I said again. Not a question the second time. Richard looked at his shoes. Judith pulled in a breath through her nose. The performance of warmth dropped, not entirely but enough. She said, "We're hoping you might be willing to help us with something, a financial matter, something that's become quite complicated and that we think you, with your expertise, might be uniquely positioned to." What kind of financial matter? I said. She explained it to me there on the porch. I listened with my arms crossed and my face completely neutral. What it amounted to was this. Grandma June's trust had finally been prepared for disbursement after years of estate delays and legal complications. A significant sum, she said 7 figures with the careful casualness of someone who says 7 figures often enough that they think it sounds casual. But there was a problem. A tax liability had emerged during the disbursement process, something to do with how the trust had been structured, an oversight that had compounded over the years. Their current accountant had made errors. They were facing a substantial audit and potential penalties, and the whole thing was complicated by the fact that several of the trust's original documents contained inconsistencies that could be read in the wrong light as intentional. They needed a forensic financial consultant. They needed someone who could review the structure of the trust, identify where the inconsistencies had come from, and help them build a clean narrative for the IRS before the audit concluded. They needed me. I stood there and listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not react. When Judith finished, there was a pause that she clearly expected me to fill, and I did not fill it, and the pause stretched out like taffy until it became uncomfortable for everyone except me. How much is the liability? I said finally. Judith named a number. I did not blink. And what are you offering in exchange for my services? I said. Richard looked up. He actually looked surprised that I'd asked that, as though he'd expected me to just help them because we had once been family, because they were in need, because, I don't know, because that's what people do when Judith asks them. I had been that person once. I was not that person anymore. We thought, Judith started. I charge $450 an hour for forensic consulting, I said. For something of this scope and complexity, we're likely looking at 60 to 80 hours minimum. That's between $27,000 and $36,000. I would need a retainer of 50% before I open the file. Do you want me to send a formal engagement letter, or would you prefer to take some time to consider? The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Judith blinked. Sloane, we thought. Given the history, given that we're practically family. We are not family, I said. Gently, not unkindly. Just clearly. You were my in-laws for 6 years. The marriage ended 8 years ago. We are 2 parties with a potential professional engagement, and I'm giving you my professional rate. Richard said quietly. We were hoping for a more personal arrangement. I don't do personal arrangements for professional services, I said. I learned that lesson a long time ago. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. Then I said, there's one more thing I should tell you so you can make an informed decision. Judith looked at me. I'm familiar with the structure of Grandma June's trust, I said. More familiar than you probably realize. After Connor and I separated, I did a lot of reading about the estate, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to understand something that had been used as an invisible lever in my marriage for years. I know where the inconsistencies in those documents came from. I know when they were introduced. And I know that the IRS, if they look closely enough, will likely reach the same conclusion I did. The color in Judith's face changed. "I'm not saying that to threaten you," I said. "I'm saying it so you understand that if you hire me, you're hiring someone with complete information. No surprises in either direction. That's actually an advantage for you if you think about it clearly." Richard was very still. "Take a few days," I said. "My contact information is on my website. If you'd like to move forward professionally, reach out through the intake form. I'll have my assistant send you the engagement terms." I looked at Judith. She was looking at me the way she had at that first handshake, 12 years ago. That same evaluating look, but something in it was different now. The balance of it had shifted. "Have a good afternoon," I said. I closed the door. Biscuit was standing in the hallway watching me. He wagged once, slowly, which is his version of applause. I went back to the kitchen and finished making my coffee and stood at the window looking out at the backyard where my unrealistically optimistic garden was, against all odds, actually doing pretty well this spring. They did send an inquiry through the intake form. 3 days later, my assistant forwarded it to me with a note that said, "This one feels a little loaded. Want me to handle it or you?" I told her I'd handle it. I reviewed their documents over the following 2 weeks. What I found was more or less what I expected. Sloppy estate planning compounded over 15 years, some genuinely unintentional errors that had snowballed, and a few decisions that were optimistic rather than fraudulent. The kind of thing that happens when wealthy families assume their accountant is paying closer attention than he is. The liability was real but manageable. I built them a clean narrative. I documented the inconsistencies and their likely innocent origins. I walked their new tax attorney through the timeline. I submitted a comprehensive written analysis to be used in their response to the IRS. I billed 218 hours. I was thorough. My invoice was paid within 30 days in full, without a single question. I don't know what happened after that. Whether the audit resolved cleanly, whether they got the trust disbursed, whether Judith reorganized someone else's dish towels and felt better about it. I don't know, and I did not ask. What I know is this: I did the work. I charged what I'm worth. I did not give anyone a discount for things that happened a long time ago that I have already carried and set down and moved on from. I went to my sister's house for dinner that Saturday. She lives 40 minutes south of me, has twin boys who are 7 and completely feral, and I love them enormously. I sat at her kitchen table and ate spaghetti and answered the same question about dinosaurs approximately 11 times, and I drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, the way I like it, singing along to the radio in a way I would not do if anyone else were in the car. I walked into my house. Biscuit met me at the door. My house? My business. My name on things that matter. There is a version of the woman I was at 26, standing in the rain, holding a cardboard box. Who would not recognize this? Who might not believe it was possible? I wish I could tell her. I wish I could stand in that parking lot with her and say, "You are going to be so fine. You are going to be so much more than fine." But she had to be there first. She had to carry all of it first. The dishes moved without asking, the laughing at things that weren't funny, the slow erasure of herself in rooms that were supposed to be her home. She had to live through all of it to get here. I don't regret a single step of it. That's not the same as saying it was okay. It wasn't okay. But I own it now the way I own the house, fully, without conditions, mine to do with what I choose. What I choose is this. My grandmother used to say, "The people who need you most will treat you like they need you least." She said it in the context of men, but it applies more broadly than that. It applies to families and institutions and anyone who has ever taken someone's steadiness for granted, because they assumed it would just always be there. I am steady. I was steady at 26 and I am steady at 38 and I will be steady at 60. That is not a thing that can be borrowed. It is not a thing that can be used and returned. It is entirely mine. The people who taught me that taught me it by taking. I almost want to thank them. Almost. But I have a retainer policy, and I charge for my time. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to get what you deserve, not in a cosmic sense. I don't put much stock in the idea that the universe is keeping score. But I do believe that the choices people make over years and years have a way of compressing into a single moment. And when that moment arrives, there's no softening it. It just is what it is. Judith spent years making me smaller in rooms that were supposed to be mine. Not with cruelty, with something more insidious than cruelty. With the steady, patient assumption that I would accommodate, that I would adjust, but I would want her approval enough to keep shrinking toward it. And for a long time I did. Not because I was weak, because I was 20-something and trying to belong somewhere, and I hadn't yet learned that belonging bought at the cost of yourself is not belonging at all. It's just a longer way of being alone. What I know now, and what I wish I could have told the version of me standing in that Seattle apartment rearranging dish towels so Judith wouldn't rearrange them first, is this: the people who take from you without asking are counting on you never to name it. The moment you name it, clearly and without apology, the whole arrangement collapses. Because it only works in silence. It only works when you're still pretending. I stopped pretending. That's the whole story, really. The house in Portland, the firm, the 218 hours I billed against Grandma June's trust. All of it traces back to one decision I made at 30, standing in an empty apartment doing math on my own life and deciding I was done. Not angry, not bitter, just done. There's a difference between holding a grudge and holding a standard. I did not go to the door that April afternoon with any desire to wound Judith or humiliate Richard. I went to the door because someone rang the bell, and then I told the truth about what I was worth and what I was willing to do and what our relationship actually was at this point in time. That's not revenge. That's just clarity. Clarity is what happens when you stop being afraid of someone's disappointment. Connor was not a villain in this story. Neither, honestly, were his parents. Not in the way that villains are in stories anyway. They were people who had learned a certain way of moving through the world, who had never been made uncomfortable enough to question it, and who ultimately faced a consequence not because the universe delivered justice, but because they ran out of people willing to absorb the cost of their assumptions. I was that person once. I am not that person now. What I kept from all of it was the work ethic my parents gave me. My mom, who got up before sunrise for someone else's family. My dad, who drove through weather that would make most people call out. They never taught me that life was fair. They taught me that you show up anyway, that you do the work anyway, that your name, your actual name, means something if you make it mean something. Callaway Financial Consulting, my mother's name, on something that matters. That's what I wanted. That's what I built. And when Judith and Richard showed up needing exactly the kind of thing I'd spent 8 years becoming good at, the only thing I felt, standing at that door with my arms crossed and my face completely calm, was grateful. Grateful that I'd done the work. Grateful that I knew what I was worth. Grateful that for once, in all the years I had known these people, the terms were entirely mine.